Greetings all. Welcome. Peace and justice to each of you that are joining us tonight. First, let me welcome all of you to this virtual space. I am Nathan Jeremy Brink, the Feeks Assistant Professor of the History of Global Christianity here at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. And I greet all of you not only on behalf of my institution, New Brunswick Theological Seminary here in New Brunswick, New Jersey, but also from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, and BETHANY Theological Seminary in Richmond, Indiana. Now, I greet you on behalf of 3 seminaries, and that's in part because tonight's event is an unusual one in that we're coming together for a multi-seminary conversation. Perhaps together we can leverage this moment amidst lingering restrictions of a pandemic and ongoing national and community conversations around racial justice to ignite activism in our respective institutions, our seminaries, and our churches. I think it's worth saying tonight, since we are gathered as 3 different seminary communities, that the varied theological traditions of our institutions that inform who we are and who our speaker is represents a rather unusual collective. Our histories tell us that across these traditions, we haven't often listened to each other well, if at all. Some of our traditions have even committed violence against the other. There's also something to be said about shared and distinct histories of our institutions with respect to race and racism. Some of our institutions now, in the present, feature racially and theologically diverse faculties and students. Still, we each have our own work to do, grappling with institutional memory that at some of our schools stretches back to the 18th and 19th century. And in some instances and various ways that looked away from or even justified displacement of indigenous communities or the enslavement and economic exploitation of Black people. While each of us and our institutions have chapters of our histories we celebrate, there are many more sites, especially around this topic of anti-racism, that require further excavation and reflection. But if there was ever an opening for us to make good on our commitments that each of our seminaries profess around ecumenism and anti-racism, the time is now. Some of our churches continue long-standing traditions of advocacy for social witness, and others are more recently awakening to new opportunities for response to social and political injustices. The question we hope to address tonight, with the help of our esteemed scholar guest, Dr. Drew G.I. Hart, is this: how will we organize and sustain this vital work of racial, economic, and social justice? I already mentioned the distinguished guest that we have who's going to help us talk through and work through some of these questions. Drew G.I. Hart is an assistant professor of theology at Messiah University and has also been a pastor for 10 years. He is the program director of Messiah University's Thriving Together Congregations for Racial Justice program that's doing some really exciting work around these issues as well. He's also the co-host of the Inverse podcast. In addition to writing things for other academics, I really appreciate that Dr. Hart's books are able to bring in personal stories and social insights to really speak to the church and broader audiences. And we're talking tonight about the second of his 2 excellent books on the subject. His first, that was published in 2016, was Trouble I've Seen: Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. And this book that we will be talking about in depth tonight is his most recent book, published in 2020, Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Dr. Hart was the recipient of BCM Peace's 2017 Peacemaker Award. In other words, he's got some activist and community chops too. The 2019 Du Bois Award in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and was Elizabethtown College's 2019 Peace Fellow. Dr. Hart and his family live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And you can add him on Twitter and Instagram at Drew Hart. He's got quite a following. So it's great for those of you who might even be joining us hearing about this online that have come to join the conversation as well. After tonight's keynote and discussion from Dr. Hart, joining me in moderating our questions from students, faculty, and community members will be the Reverend Nanette Banks, a great friend of mine, and currently the Vice President for Community Engagement and Alumni Relations at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. I'd say more about her work. She's got big things coming too. Without further belaboring the point, I turn it over to you, Dr. Drew Hart.
Thank you, Nate. I'm really grateful for that introduction and also just for the opportunity to engage all three seminaries together. I would want to say more about even just how me and Nate connected, and the short form of it is on our way to a James Cone session.
That's right.
We ran into each other at AAR in Chicago. Certainly my first time at AAR.
Yeah, and you know what I'll say too.
Yeah.
The earnestness of trying to work through these questions. As we were seminarian grad students. Yeah. Trying to wrestle with this, I think, is a through line. And so seeing that on display in your work has always given it a sense of realness that I really appreciate.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I'm also grateful for Reverend Nanette Banks and just her willingness as well to moderate. And so I'm really looking forward to our conversation at the back end. But what an opportunity to engage in a multi-seminary conversation, three different distinct traditions. And so I'm hoping that the content that I have for us and then our conversation together could be enriching and meaningful and substantive for all of us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will begin. So, my talk today is igniting anti-racist activism, and really a lot of what I was asked to do is to just really start off just sharing some key points, some highlights from my book, Who Will Be a Witness. And so I'll use at least pieces of that as we journey along to kind of create space for conversation for us later. Kind of the focus that I'm going to draw us into today is four things. This is our roadmap for our conversation. First is to explore the idea of Christian supremacy over the West, birthing white supremacy around the world. Secondly, it is this idea that I call liberating Barabbas. Third, it's igniting anti-racist congregations. And then finally, igniting anti-racist activism. So first, we'll begin with Christian supremacy over the West and how it birthed white supremacy around the world. What I'm going to do, because I know most folks here are connected to seminary, so we're just going to do like speed church history, right? Many already know about the early church and Constantine and the rise of Christendom and Theodosius in the West, and eventually, this big thing that we call Christendom that peaks into, the Crusades and such a millennium later. And so have all of that in the backdrop and thinking about the context in which Western Christianity is conflated with Western society conflates itself with Christianity. And out of that world in Portugal in 1441, you have the beginning of the slave trade. Enslaved Africans Portugal is enslaving Africans. And so you see the Christian West engaging for the first time in this slavery. But what is often missed sometimes is that then in 1455, after that, right, after the slavery has already begun, there's this papal bull called Romanus Pontifex, which basically gives permission. It does the theological heavy lifting that gives permission for Portugal and Spain, and then therefore the rest of the West to engage in this kind of conquest. And so the church is deeply involved doing theological adjusting, bolstering the colonial project. And out of that, then Western Christian colonial conquest emerges, plunder, enslavements, the Atlantic slave trade, right? All of that emerges in the context and in the aftermath of this history. And sometimes in the US, sometimes we start the story at 1619, but I believe it's a much longer story. And what we see in the midst of all of that is, and I hope your attention is drawn to this image here. It's that you have this whitening of Jesus, right? Not just a westernizing of Jesus that already had begun to happening, but a whitening of Jesus on top of that. And Jesus then becomes a mascot for social dominance and a mascot for the status quo. Notice in the picture, you have what I believe at the time was supposed to be a positive image, right? Jesus as a figure that is embracing the world, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, right? That's the idea that's being communicated. But behind that, clearly we see the paternalism, the white supremacy, the condescension. You notice the black child, right? Naked, on the grounds with the only one, their full back and no face pointing towards us. And everyone is gazing towards this white Jesus, right? And we're told that as followers of Jesus, we're supposed to want to be like him. What happens when whiteness and Jesus are conflated and compressed together? This image perfectly illustrates the aftermath of the colonial project and how Christianity was so deeply tangled and mangled within it. And in light of that, then, it forces us to ask some hard questions that force us to wrestle with how does it impact our theology, our discipleship, what we call mission, or some people even call missions, ecclesiology, our communal worship, our storytelling, our economics, our politics. These are things all touched by white supremacy as a diseased social imagination, if we're going to use Willie James Jennings' language, right? That none of these areas are untouched by colonialism and the colonial project. So next, I want us to take a brief moment. If that's the case, that Jesus has been whitened and turned into a mascot for the status quo, then I want to begin to think about ways that we can, even through a scriptural reading, a close scriptural reading, begin to liberate our understanding of who Jesus is. And I want to suggest that a closer reading of Barabbas will help us get to a better reading on Jesus as well. Now, what's fascinating is if you Google Barabbas, or if you pay attention to mainstream depictions of Barabbas over the years, that there are many depictions of Barabbas in the mainstream, like movies and things like that, where Barabbas is given this really kind of brute characterization. He's used stereotypes as this crazed person. Sometimes he's cockeyed. Sometimes he's foaming at the mouth. There's one film where he's like laughing uncontrollably like a mad person, right? And so you have all these images that in many ways I believe are designed to denigrate the image of Barabbas. But what I'm curious about is, what do we actually know about who he is? What does Scripture say? How does the history of the first century help us to understand who Barabbas is in ways that I think our popular imagination of Barabbas as this serial killer or this just simple murderer that's going around randomly killing people, that those images of Barabbas are actually not very helpful. And so we want to dig deeper and begin to liberate our understanding of who Barabbas is and the kind of concerns that he was bringing into the Jesus story. Without, again, given that so many of you all are seminary students, I'm not going to get into deep details, but if anybody wants to, I get into a lot more in my book. But the big idea to understand before we even talk about Barabbas and before we even understand Jesus's context is to acknowledge and name the fact that revolution was in the air in the first century. Well before Jesus and Barabbas arrived on the scene, you have the Maccabees, right? And you have all kinds of Jewish resistance to empire that already existed. And then during Jesus's time, from the moment before he was born, during his birth, and up through even after his birth, up to like the Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 70 AD, you have ongoing resistance to empire that's happening all around him. And so what now often gets called the zealots was something that was emerging and growing in the first century. And that is the kind of air that Jesus lived in and that Barabbas lived in as well. There was revolution, there was resistance. There was this belief that because they were people of God, they had to resist and not comply with Caesar and empire and things like that. So with that as a backdrop, I want us to just pay attention to a couple key texts that mention Barabbas through all the different Gospels. Notice first in Mark 15:7, it says, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising, right? So Barabbas is being described as someone he's been arrested because he was a part of this insurrection and he had committed murder in the uprising. Luke 23:19, it says Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder, right? Again, insurrection is what he's being accused of. Again, in Luke 23:25, it says he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. John 18:40 says this, they shouted back, no, not him, give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. And I think it's interesting to note that even Barabbas is described in Gospel of John, which sometimes people think of as more of a theological, not getting involved on that stuff. And still, we're getting this socio-political description of who Barabbas is. And then finally, in Gospel of Matthew, we see a slightly different description, but something very fascinating happens in the Gospel of Matthew. So 27:16 and 17 say this, at that time, they had a notorious prisoner. So it's just assumed everyone knows who this guy is, called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, who do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah, right? And what's fascinating, depending on your translation, some translations will say Jesus Barabbas and some won't. The earliest manuscripts say Jesus Barabbas. And so most of the newer translations will include that. But depending on what your translation is, it may not. It might just have, if you have good scholarly notes at the bottom, it'll mention that that's a part of the tradition. And so what you have there is, through all of these descriptions, is Barabbas is not being used as a foil to Jesus in terms of Jesus is innocent and Barabbas is guilty. Jesus is the sinless one and Barabbas is the guilty one who deserves death. That's not what they want to say about Barabbas. Consistently throughout the Gospels, what they want to say about Barabbas is socio-political, right? Barabbas engaged in insurrection against the empire. The Jews were the Rome had their foot on the Jews' neck, and there were folks that wanted to resist and wanted to overthrow. They wanted freedom. They wanted independence. That's what's being described about who Barabbas is. And so in Matthew, this choice is, who do you want, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, right? Jesus meaning Yeshua, the one who saves, the liberator, right? Barabbas, the son of the Father, right? Which one do you want? Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, or this other one, this other Jesus, this other liberator who is son of the Father? And given that they both have socio-political connotations, Jesus also, he was not just a spiritual person, but he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so we have two visions, two folks interested in God's dream, in restoration, in liberation. But the difference is just the means by which they were going about it, right? Barabbas is willing to kill his enemies and Jesus is not willing to kill them, but they both desire freedom and liberation for their people. And so there's this choice that's being given in all the Gospels. That's why every single Gospel, Barabbas shows up at the end of the story. It's very fascinating to think about why Barabbas, of all folks, is consistent in all the Gospels when many things are not consistent. We don't have even birth stories for all the Jesus stories, but we do have Barabbas. I want us to hold that with us as we think about what is God inviting us into. And if we're thinking in that way and we want to understand Barabbas, then it's to let go of the characters that denigrate Barabbas as just, a crazed man, a serial killer, or any of those other kind of connotations that dismiss and ignore and water down and domesticate his socio-political commitment for liberation and independence for his own people. And so Barabbas is, think more Nat Turner and less the Joker, right? That's really what we're talking about when we're thinking about Barabbas. And if that's the case, then that begins to tell us something again about who Jesus is, that Jesus and Barabbas are live options, different ways that we can go about this work and the way that we're going to pursue God's dream for all of us. All right, so in light of that, then beginning to get a glimpse, right? That's just a teaser of the glimpse of the nonviolent revolutionary Jesus that we find in the gospel stories. I want us to begin to think about igniting anti-racist activism, both in terms of what it means to do so when we gather as the congregations, and then as we scatter and go out into the world, and what does it mean to re-transform and liberate our very ways of being, again, collectively as a community, and also then when we go out. It's not just good enough to have a prophetic witness to the powers that be when we also then reflect the same old status quo in our own gatherings. And so we want to think about both together. Some of what's important, just to frame and situate all of that, is to think about the ways that our racialized existence, that there's multiple layers and intersections that we've got to pay attention to. And so it'd be easy to just think about everything on an individual level, but there's actually multiple layers that I want us to think about and consider that need to be interrogated, that we need to engage in self-examination around, starting at what I call the top is cultural. A lot of times people will start with the structural and talk about like policies as a starting point. I want to go one step above that and talk about the cultural, because there are narratives and myths that are powerful, right? Storytelling, we underestimate how powerful a story shapes one's imagination, and then everything else falls in line of that. And so something as simple as the story of American exceptionalism, right, is a powerful narrative. If you have that narrative, then you can't deal and honestly grapple with the history of indigenous people being stripped from their traditional lands, and the genocide that took place, and being forced onto reservations. We can't take for granted, we can't grapple with the history of slavery, right? 250 years of legalized slavery since Jamestown up to the end of the Civil War. 100 years then of Jim Crow and convict leasing systems and chain gangs and peonage, and 5,000 Black men, women, and children lynched, right? All the way up to post-civil rights and mass incarceration and all these other issues that we're fighting and struggling against to this very day. So the cultural actually informs and shapes people's sense of what makes sense systemically and in terms of power dynamics, in terms of policy. And so both of those are really important. And then below that, then we have the communal, right? Who are the people that we interact with, our peers, our networks in our neighborhood, schools, workplace, faith communities, right? Then there's the interpersonal, our family, friends, social networks. And then we take accounts and do self-examination around our own lives, our own life experience, our own life opportunities, our beliefs, our biases, our habits, even our desires, right, that are formed. And sometimes we don't recognize that even desire is something shaped and socialized. And even our imagination of what is possible and what could be, right, even to be able to dream of another world is something that can be shaped, that can be limited if we've been racialized deeply. And so we've got to take account for all these different layers. And so when we begin to recognize that we have this deeply entrenched racialized and white supremacist society, and we have this centuries of white supremacy that inertia is at work, then we need to think about what's the paradigm for us to begin to make a shift, to repent, to turn the other way, and to move in deliberateness in another trajectory. I like to think about it in terms of the escalator, right? I always say that, everyone at some point should have gone the wrong way up the escalator, hopefully as a child, but if you haven't done it yet, you can still do it as an adult, that if you're able to go up the wrong way at least once. But if you have done it at least once, then you know that it takes some deliberateness to get from one floor to the other if you're going up the wrong way. You can't be casual about going up the escalator and thinking that you're going to make it. It's going to be moving faster than you're going in the other opposite direction. So you've got to be really deliberate about it, and you've got to put some energy into going up the other way. And of course, if you're standing still, you're definitely moving. You're just being swept away by the currents of the direction that the escalator is moving in. And I think that that's really a helpful analogy for thinking about the significance of what the good news of Jesus Christ is for a society that's been entrenched and drenched in white supremacy and colonialism, right? That the gospel of Jesus Christ, if it's good news for the least, last, and lost in society, what that means for a white supremacist society must mean that it's a resistance to these death-dealing forces in our society. And so that invites us into anti-racist and decolonizing discipleship and anti-racist and decolonizing church. In fact, you could say that to be faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ, to follow in the way of Jesus, you cannot be faithful in the aftermath of colonialism and not be explicitly and deliberately anti-racist and decolonizing in both discipleship and our collective communion together. And so that means that there's a lot of work to do, that if we're trying to get to this beloved community, if we're going to be striving for this thing, that there's got to be deliberateness, that we're not going to be casual about it. We can't be haphazard, and we certainly can't be passive and neutral on these issues. Christian discipleship must be explicitly and deliberately anti-racist and decolonizing. One of the things that folks want to wrestle with, there's a lot of research that's been done around multi-ethnic churches. People want multi-ethnic churches here and there. And yet, oftentimes, these spaces are white supremacists. They're colonizing. They expect people of color to assimilate into those spaces and to adopt the white supremacist framework that many people are operating out of, rather than the whole system itself being liberated. And so what does it mean to find belonging in the life of the church in the context of our white supremacist history? I a lot of times think about it in terms of when I have guests over my house. I often say to folks when they come over my house, I say, make yourself at home. And when I say make yourself at home, what I mean by that is, I don't want people all stiff and tight in my house. I don't want people to be, uncomfortable. I want them to be relaxed. And so I want them to be able to go into the kitchen and grab, a drink, put their feet up, kick their shoes off, just be relaxed. But there's certain things I actually don't mean when I say make yourself at home, right? So like if somebody comes into my crib, I don't actually want them to, come in and just start rearranging my furniture, right? That's something that's not appropriate if they're going to be coming into my house and I say, make yourself at home. That's not what I imagined. In fact, I also don't want them to, come in and like take down my family pictures and put theirs up, right? That's not what I mean by make yourself at home. And I certainly don't mean that when they come into my house, I don't want to see them coming down the steps in my bathrobe, right? That's out of bounds. And so there's certain things I mean and certain things I don't mean. And I guess what I'm saying is I don't actually mean make yourself at home. That's not what I really mean. What I just mean is be comfortable, right? God has still working on me. I haven't fully broken down the dividing line between guest and host. And so I think that's a helpful paradigm, first and foremost, to think about the ways in which in many churches, you can see that white norms and preferences and ideologies and theologies are at the center, and everyone else is expected to assimilate into those things. So long as that remains the norm and the practice, then there will be no liberation from white supremacy and colonial practice. And so we've got to find new ways of thinking about belonging in Christ that disrupts white supremacy and how it shapes our sense of identity and belonging in the life of the church. But I want to take it a step further, because if we're really going to get at things, it's not just going to be surface stuff that's going to make the change. It's going to be a much more radical response to what's happening in our society. And so think about I'm married and I got 3 boys, 3 growing boys. And, sometimes Renee, that's my wife, she'll sometimes say, hey, Drew, we're a growing family and we only got like one bathroom, right, in our house. This isn't working for everybody. And if it's not working for everybody, like maybe we could build like in this one spot under the stairwell or something, we could put, a bathroom in place, build it in there so that we can have an extra bathroom for the 5 of us. Or sometimes she said, like, what if we knock down a wall and we were, going to have like more open space, right? So that people can kind of move around a little bit better, or just all these different ideas that she has. And what the reality is that it's fair game for her to ask any of these questions because she has full belonging, right? And also all our kids have full belonging in this house. And so for everyone to thrive and flourish, we've got to be willing to radically restructure the home itself, right? The very walls and structure and the building itself, that anything can be radically restructured so that everyone can flourish and thrive and have full belonging in the space. And that's the kind of radical response to white supremacy and colonialism that I think is going to be needed in the life of the church. Not just tweaks, not minor adjustments, but a radical restructuring to undermine the way that colonialism has organized our lives together. I also want us to think about the ways in which, we organize and allow white supremacy and patriarchy to be the revolving reality upon which everyone conforms and contorts their lives towards. And so I want you to, just for a moment, imagine that we were gathering in a room every week, and as we gathered every week, like I would get up on the top of the table and I would stand at the center of it and everyone else would sit around the side of the table, right? And we do this every week. Drew gets on the top, everybody else sits around. And as we gather, one week, all of a sudden, maybe Reverend Annette, she's like, hey, Drew, could you maybe, sit, down around the side of the table like everybody else? And I might not like that. I might not like the attention being called out. And so I might be like, why are you picking on me? Why am I being marginalized? Why? This is so unfair. I'm trying to steward my position for good. I didn't think that there had been any problems. Why am I being isolated and focused on, right? Highlighted. I don't like all this attention that's on me. And so I might, again, call that marginalization, right? And at that point, somebody would need to tell a more truthful story. If I call what's happening marginalization, someone else has to step up and say, hey, Drew, that's not marginalization, that's decentralization, right? Because what we're talking about here is actually a humanizing project in which I'm being brought into communion with everybody else, not in idolatry above anybody else, not below who I am, but really as full human beings, just like everybody else around the table in conversation. And I think that when we think about what's going on both in the broader society and also in the life of the church, the way that white supremacy and patriarchy have made white male bodies the center upon which everything revolves around, and even white Jesus sitting there at the center as present among us, right? How do we decenter these realities so that beloved community can be an actual reality? There are power dynamics and narratives and structures in place that have to be addressed that radically undermine and subvert white supremacy and patriarchy in our lives together. And so with that, then, when we begin to, and these are just teasers because there's so much more to be said, but when we begin to wrestle with who we are as a community together, then we're able to kind of go out and actually engage in meaningful activism as a prophetic witness in the broader society. And so that's what I want to think about now. I want us to think about some principles that I think are really important as we think about what it means to engage and wrestle and confront evil in the world, right? And so I want us to think about the things that make for shalom and nonviolent resistance as the starting point before we get into particular broader on-the-ground grassroots strategies. First, things that I believe that are really important for followers of Jesus. Number one, to recognize that every person is made in the image of God, right? And if they're made in the image of God, then there's a couple things that matter. Number one, we have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable. And then secondly, that we also recognize the humanity of enemies, right? That both of those things are possible when we recognize that everyone is made in the image of God. Number two, that we break cycles of violence and creatively maximize peace and justice in our work, and that we resist evil without becoming evil, right? And so we're not trying to just become what others have done, because then in some ways we're no longer resisting, we're just conforming to it. How do we break the cycles of violence, maximize peace and justice as whenever possible, and resist evil without becoming evil? Third, the call to take up the cross, I believe, in the way of Jesus is a fearless, courageous, nonviolent, revolutionary response to death-dealing empire, right? That Jesus himself clashed with the establishment, came into Jerusalem. According to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all happens at the climax of his life, at the end of his life. John is radical because he just starts off radical right from the jump. But all of them have him clash with the powers that be, the Jerusalem establishments, right, that were oppressing the broader masses of Jewish people, were in cahoots with the Roman Empire. And Jesus has a prophetic judgment against what's going on there. And so in that response, then we have this call to follow the radical way of Jesus in such ways that we do not obey Caesar, right? And we're willing to radically respond on the ground in nonviolent, but nonetheless revolutionary ways that do not recognize death as the final word. And so we radically resist what's happening on the ground. And then finally, I want us to think about our imagination for what we're pursuing, that we keep our eyes on shalom, right? And there's this scene in Luke 19 where Jesus, right as he's approaching Jerusalem, he says, if only they had known the things that make for peace, right? Things that make for shalom. And he's kind of lamenting the violence that's going to come in the Jewish-Roman war. And so in response to that, if you hear the suggestion that is that there are things that make for peace. There are things that make for shalom. Shalom being we're not just talking about the absence of violence, but we're talking about the presence of peace and justice and flourishing and thriving and interconnectedness for all people. What are the things that we can participate in and join in that tie into the cosmic movements of the universe leading towards God's justice and liberation? And so when we're thinking about nonviolence, there's a few things. I know that sometimes some folks are like, well, nonviolence doesn't really work like that. And so there's this kind of pessimism that's growing around nonviolence. Ironically, social science is actually suggesting the exact opposite of that, right? That when nonviolence is done in a particular way, which is, it's not just the one-hit wonder of doing marches and rallies, which sometimes it's that lazy way of thinking about nonviolence, I think is part of the reason why people think it doesn't work, because that strategy is not always going to be a very meaningful one. But when nonviolence is creative and strategic, active and sustained, it is, according to social science, extremely effective, much more than people recognize. You know, Gene Sharp came up with, this was in 1973, 198 tactics, right, of different ways that nonviolent tactics for engaging and resisting. And so there's so many more ways than the one-hit one of just marches and rallies. What they're seeing is, the social sciences are seeing, is that nonviolent movements are actually twice as successful as nonviolent ones. Twice as successful, right? In fact, what they say is that social science tells us that nonviolent campaigns globally, this is all around the world under democracies and dictators, that any time that they reach a sustained and active involvement of society of just 3.5% of the population, they are always successful, right? Again, it has to be sustained and active, right? So it's not just that 3.5% shows up one day and then that's it. But if it's an actual sustained and active movement, 3.5% is all that's actually needed, and the movements are always successful. It's very fascinating. Finally, the other thing is, along with this idea of nonviolence versus violence, they're saying that nonviolent resistance is actually growing in effectiveness. So not only is it twice as effective, but it continues to become more effective because people are honing and actually developing all kinds of really fascinating creative techniques on the ground all around the world, again, under not only democracies, but dictators. And that's violent resistance is actually decreasing in its effectiveness over time as well. And so there's actually a growing difference as well. And so we're not only talking about a theological concept in its idealistic way, but this is actually a pragmatic way of dealing and responding as well to the injustices and violences that we see in our world. So I want us to think about two things: mass protest movements and organizing. Mass protest movements, basically, if you're trying to understand what we really mean by that, because sometimes people conflate the two things, movements and organization. The key word is mobilization, right? It's about mobilizing. The strategy is trying to get as broad participation as possible. It's about creating change through social climate and the public opinion. Sometimes it's targeting the pillars of support. So it could be business and media, the religious centers, education, right? These are the pillars of support. And they use disruption, confrontation, escalation, so it's growing over time, as strategies for bringing change. Some of the strengths of mass protest movements are that they can really create huge cultural momentum, and that you can ride, and sometimes they ride the momentum that already exists, right? And what's fascinating also is that a lot of times when you have like 1,000 people out, marching or a part of a protest, die-in or something, participation usually is not as threatening, right? When there's masses of people. And so it makes joining in much more accessible for a lot of people. One of the weaknesses for mass protest movements is that often they don't require commitment from people, and there's many times not as much structure. And so without commitment and structure, those kind of movements usually are often short-lived. They can burst onto the scene and they can die out very quickly. But even when that happens, sometimes people miss the fact that sometimes they can usher in significant change even in a short amount of time. And so it's not something to just dismiss all out hand. But on the other hand, and let me give a couple examples: the Occupy movements, Black Lives Matter movements, the Me Too movement, right? These are some examples of, at least on the national level, the protest movements that have been going on in our country. And then you have community organizing. Community organizing, the key word is organization. So it kind of is a foil in some ways to the kind of protest movements. It's really about being structured and organized. So the strategy is about building a committed power base. How do you build power from the bottom, the grassroots, not top-down power, not concentrated power, but power to the people, right? Bringing ordinary people together, and using formal structures, inviting people to actually be committed to the work, and leveraging the power of the people to pursue incremental social change over the long haul. And so what's interesting about community organizing is that it doesn't matter what's popular or what's mainstream. Community organizing keeps doing its work on the ground, in its own neighborhood, seeking ongoing change and kind of as it grows, picking bigger and bigger targets for change on the ground with its neighbors. And so community organizing is, in some ways, is a different strategy when it comes to social change and activism on the ground. One of the weaknesses that this is beginning to change quite a bit, but I still see this that sometimes some community organizers can be inflexible about methodology. So there's this kind of frowning upon movements that, they have no structure, they're not organized, and they're just going to come and go, and we've got to do the ongoing work. And so sometimes these cultural moments happen where real change can happen, and community organizers could make a huge difference. And when they have that position that, they're just negative about movements altogether, they might not have the same kind of impact to take advantage of the momentum that's there, right? So I think that that's a reality, although that's beginning to change quite a bit for a lot of community organizers, that there's a lot more flexibility that's beginning to grow around strategy and methodology. And so the impact is that organizing helps ordinary people realize their agency as they accomplish local goals and grow their capacity over the long haul. I know for me, like in Pennsylvania, I work with Power Interfaith, which is a part of the Faith in Action, the national organization. I've done some stuff with MILPA, which is undocumented stuff, and there's some other stuff that I'm involved in here in Harrisburg. All right, so I want us to wrap up, and what I want to share is a story that I think hopefully can encourage us to reimagine, even the kind of theological education that goes on and the ways that both whether it be in the seminary or theological education in terms of discipleship in the local congregation, that it can encourage us as the people of God to follow in the way of Jesus in radical ways that seek peace and justice in our world. And so it's a Dr. King story. In 1963, Dr. King was in Birmingham, Alabama. And while he's there in Birmingham, Dr. King, what some of what the movement is seeing is that people are not turning out to get arrested as they had hoped in the numbers that they had hoped, right? And they had this action planned, and there was a march plan, but there was a court injunction made against them saying that they couldn't march. And not only was there injunction, but they were running out of bail funds. And so they didn't have a lot of money. And so in Birmingham, AKA Bombingham, because of all the unsolved bombings, not a lot of people wanted to go to jail indefinitely in Birmingham, Alabama. And then on top of that, most of the folks that King worked with, right, they're also ministers. And so Easter and Passover weekends were right around the corner as well. And so King and a bunch of them get together in the hotel room to kind of plan and think about what's next. So what do they do in response to this moment that they're in? And so they're there in the room, a bunch of them, and they're all discussing and arguing and debating what they should do next. And as you can imagine, there's some of them are saying like, you know, we've got to just keep pushing forward. Let's get arrested. Let's go to jail. Daddy King, King's father, is there, and he's saying, you know, you got to come back to Atlanta. What are you doing? Others are saying, let's send King out to go fundraise. If we send him out, he can raise the funds necessary to get the bails, and then we can get this movement back. Others are saying, look, we've got to be with our churches. Easter's the biggest day of the year for the Christian calendar. We can't not be at home, right? And so there's this big debate going on. And the whole time that people are debating, King isn't saying anything at all. He's just kind of listening in to what everyone else is saying. And then as they are debating and arguing, King suddenly gets up. And if you can imagine, like, it's a kind of hotel room where you have like a living room space and then a side little, a room, right, separate from it. He gets up and he goes into his room and closes the door and leaves everyone out in the living room space at the hotel room. And so they're left out there, and people are not sure what's going on, why he left. And then suddenly, after a few minutes pass, the door swings open. And if you can imagine, like, normally we see Dr. King and he's like in blue, he's in a black suit and kind of a black tie, white shirt, kind of clean look, right? Well, when he comes out, King has changed his clothes. Now, all of a sudden, King has a blue work shirt and blue jeans on. He's changed his clothes, blue work shirt, blue jeans. And the moment everyone see him, everyone knows exactly what that means, right? When they see him, they know that this means it's time to get to work. It's time to roll up our sleeves and we're going to go and get arrested, right? And for King, King was not interested in just going to church to just celebrate Jesus. He wasn't interested in just having a faith that was about observing and thinking about who Jesus is. He wanted to embody the good news, not just think and contemplate on it, right? He wanted his life to bear witness to make visible the Jesus story on the ground in his own communities. And in doing so, I believe he was understanding the deeper meaning of the gospel and what it means for us, right? Not just something to celebrate in church with the fancy clothes. Not that that is anything wrong. I enjoy my Easter service just as much as the next person. But what does it mean to actually embody the Jesus story for our neighbors? And that's precisely what they did, right? And so Good Friday, they find themselves marching, and they're all this famous pictures of Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, all wearing blue jeans and a blue work shirt, marching, leading this march, and they would then get arrested. And that's when Dr. King would write his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. And so I think that that's a great analogy for us to kind of sit with and hopefully be the invitation to ignite anti-racist activism, right? Both in terms of our own communities, the discipleship and formation that we must do to radically revolutionize and restructure our gathering and our organizing together, but then also the work that we do, the prophetic witness that we have to speak truth to power, to confront evil, to resist evil forces that work in our world, to stand in solidarity with the least, last, and lost, right? And to do so in such ways that make the Jesus story visible for our neighbors. And so so my invitation then is for each of us to put on our blue jeans. Let's put on our blue jeans for justice. Let's put on our blue jeans for peace. Let's put on our blue jeans for righteousness. Let's put on our blue jeans as we seek God's dream for all people, as we wrestle against police brutality and mass incarceration and stand in solidarity with our indigenous neighbors. Let's put on our blue jeans as we denounce anti-Asian hatred and rhetoric and speech in our society and xenophobia. Let's put on our blue jeans in solidarity with our undocumented neighbors and refugees and folks who are struggling and vulnerable, both in the boundaries of our nation and beyond. Let's put on our blue jeans and seek the way of Jesus together as the people of God. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. It's too bad we can't hear everybody, because I feel like there should be a few more amens on the line. Thank you for sharing with us these principles from your book and from your work that are not just timely, but inspiring, and in some cases demanding. You know, there's a radical reorganization of the house that you're talking about, and that's not easy work. One of the questions that I see here from one of our students, Jason Haldeman, who I believe is a BETHANY student, who's been working on some of these issues in their MDiv study, asks, can denominational identity be an asset for those anti-racist efforts or decolonizing, or is it baggage? So if it's moving things around the house, you know, what about the house itself, right? Like, or if is your denominational identity, is that the stuff of blue jeans, or is that the suit you need to take off? You know, and how to. So I think you've given us a lot to think about. The question, as we bring it to our own identity, our own selves in certain denominational and theological traditions, is like, how do we do that? And what do I do with this identity? And what kind of a thing is this identity? So I'm elaborating. I'm bringing this question from Jason to some of the themes and metaphors that you've given us to help us kind of transition to we think about ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky question, right? I mean, it is a tricky one. I think. I don't know if there's an easy answer, because half of me wants to say yes and no. I think that the first thing is to recognize that many denominations have functioned in white supremacist ways and have functioned as preserving white Jesus and preserving colonial Christianity, right? And so if we haven't grappled with that first, I don't know if we're even ready to recognize what potential or limit strengths or weaknesses our denominations will have on the other side of it, because I don't know if we have enough clarity to see that far, right? That said, I'm not anti-tradition or denomination, and I think that there's meaningful ways in which we've got to actually wrestle meaningfully with our stories. But as we do so, hopefully not in such enclosed ways, right? Not in ways like, I mean, I think there's a big difference. So I'll pick on, since I've interacted with BETHANY and I know Church of the Brethren and all stuff like that, I can pick on them maybe a little easier in love, right? So I'll say it that way when I say pick on. But like, you know, there's a difference between thinking about the Church of the Brethren in North America and thinking about, you know, AME in North America, right? Those traditions don't have the same, when it comes to white supremacy and colonialism, they just don't have the same stories, because the Church of the Brethren assimilated, as much as they might have came from persecution, they assimilated into the system of whiteness in many significant ways here in North America. And so I think that there's a lot of grappling with what does that mean? Does that mean ignoring one's tradition? Of course not. Does it mean that there's something meaningful? I believe there's deep, deep meaning and value from the Anabaptist traditions that can be gleaned and learned from. But it also means that, you know, there's some lessons and some things that maybe a community like the Church of the Brethren would need to learn from, let's say, the prophetic wing of the Black church, maybe I'll say it that way, right? And so what does it mean to wrestle in those kind of ways that are dialogical, and that are also willing to be transformed, so that what our denomination means now it'll look like it'll have a different meaning on the other side, you know? I'll use another example, which again, this is on the Anabaptist side, but this is some of the scholarship I had done. There was a guy, Hubert Brown, in the 1970s. He was a Black Mennonite, and he wrote to the Mennonites, critiquing them for their assimilation into white supremacy, whiteness. And he basically said they've lost their Anabaptism, right? And he basically said that the 16th century Anabaptists had more in common with the 1970s Black Power movement and Black theology than it does with contemporary Mennonites, right? Now, he's engaging the tradition, but he's saying that there's something more radical happening on the ground in the 16th century than what was happening at that moment. So I think that those are the kind of creative ways that we can reflect, wrestle, dialogue with other traditions, that we can't see ourselves in as having the whole thing. I think Willie Jennings talks about fragments, right? That we all have a fragment. And if we can see ourselves as having just a piece of it and needing to be in dialogue with others, so that we both lean into our story, but also hold it loosely in some ways also, I think that there's a much more fruitful, transformative, mutual exchange that can happen, a creative exchange that can happen that is more meaningful. So yeah, we got to tell our stories. We also got to interrogate the stories that we tell, right? When their own congregations as well. And so I think that is another thing. Anyway, there's so much we could say, but let's keep going.
Thank you so much, Drew. I'm blown away, really. What you're calling us to is a provocative move, right? To not only examine ourselves, but to examine our traditions. So there's some simultaneous hard work that has to go on, right? That's like right. To reimagine Barabbas, what? Right? And then put that reimagining of Barabbas in context of reimagining now who is Jesus, if you put them two together. So it's just, so thank you for the work that you're asking us to do, but I want to acknowledge it's hard work, but it's good work. And so there are a lot of how questions, right? Yeah, and so Richard asked the question, what do you feel is the best way to get others to pass their individual views on racism to be able to understand the structural and cultural significance of our racialized society?
What's the best way? Yeah. You know, all right. So, I mean, number one, I'll be honest, like I've been doing this anti-racism stuff for a long time. And I'm like, why will this person respond to this and this person not, right? So on one hand, I would first want to say, I don't know if anybody really knows, right? That's the first thing. But on the other hand, we do know certain things that, as much as someone like me likes to think that people just respond because of, you know, data and stats and things like that, that's just not what changes people, right? I think lived experiences, especially experiences that are unsettling and that create cognitive dissonance, that's powerful. Stories, right, that create cognitive dissonance, those are powerful. I think that, and giving people opportunity to see things from a different vantage point, right? I think that those things are really powerful. So, I mean, those are the kind of ways that I want to help folks. I remember I was on a civil rights bus tour. I'd gone multiple times and I was like bringing people with me. Every time I went, I would take like a crew, right? And one person had brought their dad with them, who I didn't know at the time, but like their dad was like hardcore, like, you know, at that time, Rush Limbaugh and all that kind of stuff. All right. So he's on the trip. None of us know that about him until like a little later, but he's actually like asking like deep, serious questions while he's on this trip, because his whole world doesn't make sense anymore in light of everything that he's experiencing. So he's asking questions around, you know, maybe like everything I've been taught is wrong and this and that. You know, we were kind of like, what's he talking about? You know, like we had no idea that he was like really wrestling with demons almost, so to speak, right? And so I think that unsettling experiences that tell, for example, a more truthful narrative, a more truthful story, I think are one of the ways that we can do that work. And it was also experiential, and it was also relational, right? All of those things are happening at the same time. And I think that was the recipe for like meaningful change. Now, of course, we don't get to do that with everybody, right? We don't get to send everybody on a civil rights, but I wish we could. I wish, just send everyone who's like the most ingrained racist ideologies and stuff, just send them all on a bus tour, right? But what was also sad about what happened was that afterwards, months later, he kind of fell back into where he was at because there was nothing sustained about it, right? And so I do think that we need folks that can walk with folks, that can journey, that can help create cognitive dissonance, that can help people see the systems and structures. I think that people are socialized to not understand systems and structures, right? Like it's not accidental that they don't think about these things. It's intentional, it's deliberate not knowing. And so I think when we can think about and recognize that and can bust into it, then I think there's ways that we can begin to liberate minds, hearts, bodies, souls, right? I know from my own self, like in the classroom with students, I work at a historically white, majority conservative evangelical institution, right? So that's where I teach. And when I'm there, like I teach, it's not a theology course, but first year seminar course that I teach. So first year students, and I introduce them to, usually there's a couple history books that I'll have them read that will change their paradigm, right? And then we'll get into like maybe some Black theology or something like that. But it's the history that, starting from slavery and just moving them all the way up to the present, right? It's a game changer every time because they don't actually know any of the history. And once they actually know enough, like their questions change almost immediately for many of them, right? So that's, again, different spaces, but I think that in our congregations, we need to be telling more truthful stories. Often, so some of the work that was mentioned, Nate read my bio that I'm organizing. I'm a director for a Thriving Together program. A lot of that is around race and place, right? We're trying to tell, how do we tell a truthful story about the land that we inhabit? And how do we start from the very beginning? So like I live on the land of the Susquehannock, right? Can we name the indigenous people that were displaced first, and then tell a story all the way up to the present? So that in central PA, we're talking about redlining. We're talking about restricted deeds and sundown towns. We're talking about, we got in our backyard, the Carlisle Indian boarding school, right? That's only like 30 miles away from where I live. We got the Capitol complex here, right in the city. It was built on where a Black community used to live, right? They were displaced so they could build the Capitol complex. The highway went straight through the hood. I could go on and on and on about the land and the way that it was organized and structured. These are ways, again, to enter people into stories, to tell truthful stories about where we live, and then gives us an imagination for where we need to go from there as well. So I think that those are, and we could go on and on, but we've got to tell more truthful stories. We've got to have cognitive dissonance, right? Because the inertia is just going to be taken for granted in terms of what people think they know about our nation, about our society, about the way that we live. And so we've got to disrupt that some way, somehow. And I do think for white folks in particular, I know a lot of people are saying cut off friends with everybody. And there are times, I'm not saying like just remain in the most toxic relationships, but I think white folks are giving up on folks too quickly, and forgetting that y'all were on a journey also, right? That you didn't wake up woke. In fact, many folks that think they are so woke still have a lot of learning to do themselves. And so what does it mean to journey with folks and to remember that you weren't born in the place that you are now? There were folks in your life that pointed you along the way, gave you the signposts, and directed you to keep going forward. And so that hopefully you can do that for other folks as well.
Thanks. So that answer about, answering the question about how do you break people free from, their individualism, I think, to point back to your book and one of the sort of broader things is that you show us how these myths are interrelated and interlocking. The Christian supremacism, the Western and American exceptionalism, the capitalist corporate domination of the life of the church, what you term hyper individualism, right? So that gets to that question you just answered, and a life of the church that privileges the therapeutic spirituality over an ethical discipleship. And so you frame all of these things as myths, and you're giving us so much about how do we retell the stories. If the land, connecting us with the land, making sense of how we got here, looking at our monuments. But Maurice in the Q&A points out, how do we combat electronic media? So it's one thing to, you can be a disruptor, you can show people these things, but part of that kind of wave, that gravity that pulls people back down, Maurice talks about people being constantly overwhelmed with false information, right? That these myths are built on lies. And if there's a 24/7 stream of conspiracy theorists and the QAnon and partisan media that is telling lies, how does one break through when time is so limited to actually have those interactions with people that are sort of in that tide of misinformation and that toxic American mythos, or that white supremacist or Christian supremacist mythos?
Yeah, I mean, I would just want to say to Maurice, he's asking all the right questions, right? Because I don't know if I have all the answers, but he's asking the right questions. I mean, this is our challenge right now. I mean, we cannot overstate the power of these algorithms. I mean, it's not only that we can choose the information that we're going to be fed, but then it feeds us even more and goes deeper and deeper, right? Because it's all for profit. It's all, the capitalistic system is at work here. This is powerful. And I think that I said it like I'm joking, but I really don't have great answers other than like, this is the kind of stuff that, I recognize these are death dealing forces at work in our world that we must resist. And we must take seriously as the church. We must have a prophetic voice to challenge these tech companies, because what they're doing is evil, and they're making huge profits off of destroying our even capacity to even have meaningful conversation. And it was already difficult. Like, let's not pretend like pre-Google and Facebook and stuff, like things were, there still was this hegemonic perspective that's being pushed down on folks. Otherwise we wouldn't be dealing with so much of the stuff that we've been dealing for centuries, right? So this was already a problem, but now with these tech companies, it just exacerbates these issues even more so. And so I don't have easy answers. I don't have great suggestions, other than that we've got to be putting our best minds to work and thinking thoughtfully about what does it mean to, number one, disciple folks even in our own communities. Because let's not pretend that even if we're more progressive leaning, that somehow we are not also being shaped by a particular way of thinking and seeing the world because of these algorithms. We're a part of it too. And so what does it mean to disciple people well, and to find ways to have meaningful conversation, and also then invite other people out of that? And so, again, I know in the classroom, like, I feel like I have been able to see students who were born and raised in those worlds with enough space and consistency, sustained consistency of conversation over time and learning and stuff, to break free and to begin to ask different kind of questions. But it's a rare thing to be able to, like, I go hard. I was just joking. I had a picnic or cookout thing with some young adults, and many of them were graduating seniors, and none of them were students that I had in class, but students that I had a relationship with. And they were teasing me a little bit because they're like, Dr. Hart, I wanted to take your class, but I hear like you're like really hard, like you push people really hard. And like, I hear your classes are the best, but they're also that you work them. It's because I've got a little bit of time with these folks. And especially for my white evangelical students, like I feel like this is this is not playtime for me. Like, if I'm going to be in this institution of all places, then it's all or nothing. Otherwise, I might as well go somewhere else and do other work, right? And so we've got to take it with that kind of deliberateness and disruption of people's ecosystems that they're living in. But I don't have great answers other than let's continue to put our best minds to work. And I'm hoping and praying that there are some young folks that are wrestling and thinking about other strategies on the ground that can help us disrupt this. And so this needs to be one of the key conversations because it affects everything. I mean, we can't talk about ecological destruction without talking about, again, the knowledges, what ways of knowing are we engaging in and what's shaping our reality, right? We can't talk about mass incarceration and police brutality without recognizing that this, what we've seen with our own eyes, somebody else is being fed all this other stuff that it just seems to make sense to them, right? We like to just, they just are. No, they're being fed a whole tyranny of stuff, and that we've got to take seriously the things that are being given to them. Yeah.
So thank you. Thank you for that. It's just making me think that I think the best classes for me through seminary were those that made me ask different questions because then I responded to things differently and I walked a bit differently because I had different questions and not looking for, no, just give me 1 + 1 = 2 and that's what I'll do. But then I had to do some internal work. So thank you for that. And then I'm just thinking in the back of our heads, what we just talked about, as we having this conversation in the back of my head, and I had to look it up on my phone, was when Rick Santorum says there isn't much Native American culture in American culture, right? Or in the back of my mind is the accountability of Derek Chauvin, right? But the non-accountability regarding Breonna Taylor, regarding Trayvon Martin and all of this, right? And so then we have Pastor Serentino, who asked, well, given our recent state of violent eruption of racial hate and violence in Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Louisville, how can pastors and other church workers cast bread upon the waters, interpreting the cross event to promote universal personhood and peace rather than division and isolation? So how does this become more of a unifying force as opposed to this sort of divisiveness?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess, my inkling is that the unity, the shalom, is on the other side of confrontation, right? I mean, because the division is already here. And so, I mean, even to mention the cross, like this is my interpretation and understanding of the cross, right? Is that that Jesus clashed and confronted with empire and was crushed knowingly. He accepted the consequences. He knew that when you cross Rome, it's going to come for you. It's going to crush you. It's going to try to it's going to snuff you out, right? And yet he still nonetheless came into the centers of Jerusalem, confronted the establishment, called them a den of robbers, and had a very courageous prophetic witness in response to it. And then they plotted to kill him, right? And so I think that for me, like what is going to be the basis of our unity? What is going to be the basis if we're looking, like we have to be careful that we don't just seek superficial unity where people feel good, but we haven't actually dealt with the structures and systems and the very conditions that are creating the problems in the first place. There are many, in fact, they say that, the churches that are doing best in terms of multiracial are mega churches, right? Wealthy mega churches are the most multiracial, right? Now, if we were to take it on the surface, we'd say, oh, well, then they figured this unity thing out, right? No, but it's unity across most likely class and comfort and capitalism. And all. So they've become comfortable with the very evils of our world rather than challenging and disrupting them. Jesus, on the other hand, identifies and lives in solidarity with the Samaritan, the vulnerable women, the poor, those who are stigmatized and marginalized in society, right? The least, last, and lost. And so, like, that's the basis. To be in Christ is to not be, to find one's identity and belonging first and foremost in Christ is to not have it first and foremost in the empire, right? And so I think that that's the basis. It's that our unity is going to be found first and foremost in the cracks and margins and edges of society, and inviting others into that, right? Everybody is welcome in that space. That's the universal goodness of God, of the good news, is everyone's welcome, but not everyone is going to see that as good news. Not everyone, there's Zacchaeus and the rich young ruler, right? Two different responses to the economic jubilee of Jesus, right? One walks away sad because he's got great wealth. And Zacchaeus, nonetheless, has a Jesus moment, right? And he wants to do redistribution of wealth, half of his money to the poor, and reparations, right? 4 times what he had exploited from others as a tax collector. These are the different kind of responses. He is brought back into the fold. He's now recognized truly as a son of Abraham. He was once lost and now he's saved, right? Salvation has come to this house. And I think that that's the kind of radical, undomesticated good news, and then therefore unity that I want to seek. And at the same time, doing it in such ways that I always keep up my eye on God's dream for all creation and all people, right? That's shalom. That is, that there's space for everyone. That God's ultimate, the guiding and ushering of creation along, that the ultimate goal and the end is for all of creation. And so how do I not demonize and try to seek to destroy my enemies? I think that that's the loving action, but I can't force them into beloved community. And I think that that's the other part that, so sometimes if they're harming other people, I have to confront them and I have to protect those who are most vulnerable, not destroying them, but also being committed to the least and last in society as well.
Excellent. So this idea of the things we stand for and what deliverance looks like, you're framing as some things that have to be dismantled, some things that have to be destroyed. I want to highlight and bring into the conversation a question from Sonia, who says a stumbling block for some congregational folks are concerns about engaging with Black-led organizations that haven't spoken against property destruction that's been associated with some protests, although not carried out by those organizations. Most folks say, I was with them until they became violent. It seems, Sonia says, that their white perspective on nonviolence makes them unable to distinguish between occasional actions that come out of rage and fear with the perpetual violence endured by Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And wants to know your thoughts. And this is a great question from Sonia, because I think in reading your book, I too, it's a line you walk around nonviolence that is different than pacifism. And you don't put pacifism on a pedestal. No. So how do we engage that? Yeah.
In fact, I do identify someone as a peacemaker and committed to nonviolence in the way of Jesus, right? And at the same time, don't call myself a pacifist. And I'm critical of white Christian pacifism, very critical. In fact, even my Liberating Barabbas chapter, that is inviting people to opt out of violence, is also then critical of it. But you'll have to read it because I can't get into it now. But let me start by saying this. We need a more healthy analysis of violence. That's the starting point, is that we need a healthy diagnosis of the problem and what's going on around us. So imagine this. You walk into a room and you see an adult beating down on a toddler, right? They're just pounding on this toddler. You walk into the room, and right as you walk in, you see the toddler on their back and they hit the adult back once, right? Now imagine that as that's happening, you start yelling at the toddler. How dare you use violence? That's so wrong of you. Violence doesn't solve problems. It's always wrong and it doesn't solve anything, right? That would be ridiculous. It would actually be offensive, right? And problematic if you were to not try to stop the violence from the adults, but try to condemn the violence of this toddler who's being beaten down on, right? Now imagine, just per se, let's try to imagine a people that have been enslaved for centuries. that after formal slavery ended, the U.S. government allowed convict leasing systems, neo-slavery, peonage, chain gangs, legalized torture and violence, lynchings, control of movement. Let's just imagine that a place like this happened, right? And then after that, after civil rights came, mass incarceration, over 2 million people, targeted, underfunded schools, all kinds of brutality and insults in their communities, and all kinds of narratives, again, insulting their very humanity. Just imagine that that happens. And then to be upset when, let's say, a Target gets burned down, rather than concerned about centuries of the government beating down on Black people. That's, I think, is the problem, is that our analysis of violence is so skewed, so distorted, that we look at these individualistic little moments and can't see the scheme of violence in all its forms being executed and thrown down on poor Black communities especially, right? And so I think that that's really what I think is the first step, is that we need a healthy analysis of violence in its fullest form, and not just the superficial response to systemic violence that's happening all around us. Once we can do that, then we can have a meaningful conversation about what should we do. Now, the fact of the matter is that, again, when we talk about algorithms and all that stuff, I mean, a lot of people didn't see, but there were lots of research done showing that, what was it, like 93% of all the Black Lives Matter movement stuff was peaceful, right? It was the large majority of them were peaceful. So the narrative that all this violence is happening, number one, it's just fiction. It's just not true. I was at many, in fact, I spoke at some, I did all kinds of stuff. I've never seen folks that engaging in actual violence against other people, right? In fact, and that's another step, which is, if you go to Dr. King's writings, as he's reflecting on the Black Power movement and what's going on there, and some of the riots that's happening, one of the things that Dr. King notes that I think is really important is he notes that much of the destruction that's happening, that Black people were mostly targeting buildings and not people, right? Which is actually interesting. Like he's naming, like, we've got to distinguish between buildings, people, and it's not to say, like, Dr. King actually didn't think it was constructive what they were doing. He didn't think it was constructive in terms of, he didn't think that was going to ultimately help them get the closest, because a lot of times, especially in the US, because of narratives and our ideologies around property, that can turn people away from stuff. All right. So I think, just from a strategic point of how people think about property in our nation, I don't actually think that it helps. But there is a difference between destroying property, especially from these multinational corporations, and then thinking about taking lives. And actually, it's very few of Black movements through our history. There are moments, but there's very few where the focus has been on destroying our enemies, right? That's just not been the mainstream of what's been going on, and it's certainly not been the mainstream of Black Lives Matter movement either. So anyway, we could go on and on and on, but I think that these are some of the issues that I think we've got to kind of differentiate between. And I think, going again with Dr. King, he says we've got to move from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. When we begin to have these kind of revolutions of values, right, then I think we can have a better analysis of how do we move forward. I am, again, committed to the peacemaking of Jesus. But I also, and you can, if you read my Liberating Barabbas, is that some of, I think, what's important is, as Jesus laments and he says, if only they had known the things that make for peace, he's lamenting, he's not condemning them. He actually identifies and is sorry about the violence that's going to come down into Jewish-Roman war. And Jesus does not do it from the sidelines. He enters in and he struggles in his own way. So he's not talking, I'm tired of folks talking about what people should be doing if they're not doing anything. If you're not involved in any movement work, if you're not struggling, then you really ought to just keep quiet and actually just be taking notes from others who are actually involved in seeking liberation and peace for others.
That's wow. Okay. So I'm just going to mind the chat here for a minute, and a couple of things that folks have said. Thank you for speaking with such direct clarity to this in particular. And then from Troy Underwood, it said it's important to not let others control the narrative. And so how do we trust in our own, not our own, but how do we begin to move towards a more communal narrative or truthful narrative, right? as opposed to what's just simply been handed down through the images.
Yeah.
And through white supremacy. So how do we liberate the narratives from the grip of white supremacy?
Yeah, I think it's got to be a multi-pronged approach, right? I mean, one of the things I love so if you haven't been at some point, go down and see Brian Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, Alabama, right? One of the things I love about what he's doing there, I mean, you think about, he's a lawyer, right? So you'd think, oh, you're just gonna go down and see lawyer stuff, right? No, like he decided we can't just stay in our lane. We've got to change the narrative, right? And so they got monuments and museums and films that they're making, all kinds of stuff, because he understands that at that cultural level, that's what I was getting at. That cultural level is really important. The narratives that we tell are powerful. And I think if we underestimate how powerful the narrative is, then we've already lost, right? If we're not struggling at that level. And so I love the idea, like, I mean, what they're doing is creating the lynching memorials that not only there, but that can be taken back all around the nation, especially through the South, because in the South, I mean, Confederate statues are everywhere, streets, schools, everything, right? It's a narrative that's being told literally through the landscape. What does it mean to disrupt that and tell a more truthful narrative, right? What does it mean? Again, what resources are we using? What stories do we tell? And how do we make space for storytelling communally? Again, I don't know if there's like any one which way to do it, but I do know that we have to be thinking about this. How do we tell truthful stories? And if, as followers of Jesus, in our own communities, if we can't tell truthful narratives, then in many ways, you know, I mean, it's a lot of despair then if we can't even tell a truthful narrative in the life of the worshiping community, the God that we say is the God of truth. So, and as we do that, though, we do that humbly, right? Because to tell a truthful story is also to acknowledge I only have a part, that I am not God, right? That I don't claim to be the universal, because that was the very move of the colonialists, right? That I got the whole story and nothing but the story, and there's nothing else to say on it, right? And so we take the particular and impose it as universal on everybody else. We can't engage in that either. And so how do we tell more truthful stories from within the particular realities that we live in? Tell our people's stories, tell our own lived experience, share as other people tell their stories, to hold them sacred and to pass them on and as gifts to others, right? And allow them to be transformative to us. I think that's the starting point, is even that we can be a community that holds the sacred stories of those whose backs have been against the wall, right? That those stories are treasured in our communities. Then we model what storytelling can look like and whose stories are prioritized, right? That the first are last and the last are first, so that we actually make space for particular stories to carry extra weight in our community, precisely because of their own lived experiences, right? I think that that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen. I know one thing, I'll just give an example of this in the flesh. So I do podcasting with Jared McKenna. He's in Australia. So we have this kind of like weird global community. We, along with podcasting, we have something that we do called Subversive Seminary. And so we'll read different books. We've done my books. We've done M. Sean Copeland recently, Howard Thurman, just a bunch of different folks. Right now we're doing J. Denny Weaver's Nonviolent Atonement. So we've done all. But one of our practices is we, at the beginning of each time that we gather, it's not just me and Jared talking. It's a communal conversation. We break people into groups and we come back. And when we come back, we explicitly say, white men, we're inviting you to be first listeners in this space. And we invite, in particular, women of color, and then people of color in general, and women and others that have been more stigmatized in our society. We're inviting them to lead into the conversation first, to open up the conversation, right? And that's putting flesh into storytelling, where what stories are going to be told and prioritized, so that we don't just fall into the patterns of how we're socialized to interact, right? Where some folks just feel entitled to just take up all the space, and other folks, because they've been silenced before, don't feel like their voice matters, they know in this space that certain voices are going to be prioritized, right? And I think that that's the kind of practices, right, that we need that can actually put some flesh and feet on how we do storytelling in local gatherings together.
Excellent. Wonderful. And one of the questions in the chat from one of our students was, can you say more about storytelling? So I'm glad you took us back there, because it really is powerful to rethink who and who's telling those stories and how they're being told and to what ends. You remind us the importance of scripture and being arrested by that, telling our own stories, engaging our histories, but not just in this abstract way, in a way that it changes the very clothes we wear. We got on the Q&A, we've got Bethany and NBTS presidents going back and forth, President McCreary and President Carter, talking about where they're going to get the denim and trade in the bow ties and suits for blue jeans and work blouses. So I'll be interested to see the denim blouses on our presidents here. But you kind of give us this whole picture. I think to go back to something you say in the book that I think is something that you charge us with, is that there's some costs that are going to have to be counted, and with this view, it's not just a dismantling of myths and ideologies, but actual churches are going to have to interrogate the way they worship, what they preach about, how they read the Bible, where they give their money, who sits where, how they make decisions, right? That counting of the cost of this is something that we need to do as institutions, as seminaries, as churches. And so I commend to all of our students and faculty and community members to really dig into that, because that's not formulaic. That's a charge. And it has to be done in contextually relevant ways. So I really appreciate that, and want to thank you from all three seminaries, from NBTS and McCormick and Bethany. And any last word, Nanette, before we give the last one to Drew?
I really just want to say, if we do seminary right, and I mean from administration to staff to faculty and to students, then this is what we will get. Folks asking different questions and being willing to interrogate, literally put the spotlight on it and interrogate what stories and images we've digested and have been living by. So I feel like if we do it right on both sides, that we will get to these different questions. So just
Amen.
Thank you. I appreciate you for being here. And glad to be a part of this, Nate. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Amen. And with that, you've been so generous with us. So I'll give Preacher Drew Hart the last word.
Yeah, I'll just say, well, both my books, Trouble I've Seen is really Antiracist Discipleship, came out in 2016, and Who Will Be a Witness then kind of builds on that. And so those are available anywhere books are sold, and Who Will Be a Witness is actually available on audiobook now. So you can listen. I can't listen to myself, but you can listen to me reading the book. And also you can catch me, as I mentioned, Inverse Podcast. Check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's a different kind of podcast. So I encourage you to check that out. But I guess I'll just re-emphasize just the point I made around the idea that with the escalator, right, that if we are going to be in the context, in the aftermath of colonialism and white supremacy, that our discipleship must be explicitly and deliberately anti-racist and decolonizing. That everything, we've got to interrogate it, everything, in ways that we probably can't even imagine, and that I'm sure I'm only scratching the surface, because we don't realize how much our worlds have been flipped upside down because of what the church did, right? And maybe that's the other narrative that we've got to tell a more truthful story about, which I kind of hinted at, but I didn't say explicitly. It's not just that the church was complicit in racism, we birthed modern racism and white supremacy into the world as a theological distortion in practice. And so we've got to be explicitly and intentionally and deliberately anti-racist and decolonizing in the work that we do moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you again, and thank you from all of our institutions. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Please go forth with ignited, on fire, to really do this work of shalom. Have a good night.